How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chapulati, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.
Welcome to greeneconomy.tv. I'm your host and facilitator, Byron McDonald. Today on our show, actually, we have the third episode of the Circular Show. And our usual guest, Chris Whyte, Director of African Circular Economy Network, and Gordon Brown from the Green Economy Journal publisher. But before I go ahead, as I say each show, greeneconomy.tv provide insight and intelligence on all sustainability-related matters. So let's invite on our guests. Kind of forgot the names there. I don't know why. I kind of forgot the names there. I say it each week. Maybe because we missed. How are you guys doing?
Good yourself.
Good.
What a pleasure. Thank you, Byron.
Gordon, I'm going to give it over to you to ask all the relevant questions as usual. If that's fine with you.
No, what a pleasure, and welcome indeed to Chris Whyte to our show on circular economy here on greeneconomy.tv. So, quick recap. In our first show of this series, we asked Chris to talk to us about circular economy, the broader practice, the body of thinking, how it fits in, and all the positive outcomes that can flow from the implementation of these principles. And last week we spoke about some cool success stories in the African context and the South African context of circular economy. This week, and I guess it's very pertinent because it's certainly in the news currently. There's some new regulations that have been put in motion. We are talking about extended producer responsibility. So, without further ado, Chris, what does this mean? What is extended producer responsibility, and why is it important?
We've got to remember that extended producer responsibility is an extension of producer responsibility. So first and foremost, companies, producers should be taking responsibility for what they're doing in terms of making sure that we care for the planet and that we care for people. It shouldn't all be about profit. And we've seen quite a lot of move towards that recently under the banner of sustainability, where companies are looking at it from the perspective of their own financial sustainability as well as their relevance in the market. Extended producer responsibility takes it beyond there. So now once that product has hit the consumer, they still need to take responsibility for that product thereafter. And this is what we've been seeing in terms of a lot of the work we're seeing internationally about global plastic wastes, ocean plastics. How do we look at extending that responsibility to beyond the consumer? So it's a vital component in terms of unpacking that, but also to implement systems and guidelines and directives that would oversee that extended producer responsibility.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you touch on an interesting point that I'd like to speak about very briefly and get your opinion on. This notion of a potential conflict between environment and profit. And I think, isn't this an example perhaps of where we see companies voluntarily stepping out and extending their responsibility or offering to extend it through implementing programs, etc. We see a most recent announcement by IKEA, the furniture company, stepping out into the market and saying, you know what, we're going to take responsibility. We're offering to take the stuff back. And in fact, in IKEA's place, they're actually willing to buy it back. We'll take this back from you, Mr. Consumer, and we'll dispose of it responsibly, or better still, we'll actually put it back in our systems or do something with it that means we can recycle or upcycle or reuse or whatever the case may be. Isn't this also a way that these companies are able to differentiate themselves and to ultimately be more successful?
Well, it's not just corporations. You're seeing it with governments as well. I mean, the reality in terms of the way the world is changing is that people are becoming more aware with social media and the proliferation of information available. People are slowly starting to understand more and more about the impact that they have, and they need to understand both their input and actions, as well as what is imposed on them in terms of being a consumerist society, which we've developed over the last 60 to 70 years. And what you're seeing is that a lot of these bigger organizations, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, IKEA, they have taken the first bold step to voluntarily drive their extended producer responsibility. And that really has put a lot of these big corporations in the driving seat. And what we're seeing often is that legislation policy tends to chase what's actually happening in the business world. And I think if we had looked at and imposing a strict sort of EPR, extended producer responsibility, before this, it would have been very difficult to see alignment within the industry. But we're seeing leadership from industry. And I think a lot of that is around their understanding that they need to be aware of their long-term sustainability and their responsibility to their consumers, because the consumers are now demanding it. Consumers are a lot more educated and aware than they were. And that's becoming more and more the case all the time. So you have that first mover advantage, and hats off to them. The issue with that is that often what happens is that a lot of the smaller organizations are basically getting an economic advantage out of not having to follow that extended producer responsibility, because it's often quite expensive. And the idea behind implemented or directives and guidelines on EPR is to close the net and pull in everybody else. So we have the leaders, we have the followers, and we're going to have those who are going to be dragging their heels for a while. And that's why EPR also needs not only incentives, but it needs penalties to bring everybody into the loop.
Well, great. And that segues perfectly into perhaps the bulk of what we're going to chat about today. Is talking about this EPR in the context of South Africa. So we've recently had some new regulations implemented. But before we go into talk about the actual questions that emanate from the release from government, I wanted to just chat to you about that. So in South Africa, we have some excellent examples, I believe, of how industries, so either companies specifically or perhaps more pertinently, sector groupings or sector representative bodies have been quite effective at running these certain extended producer responsibility initiatives, largely under the heading of recycling. I'm thinking of the plastics industry, the paper industry, even certain elements of the motor industry. Perhaps just give me your sense of how you see the South African market currently, as to where are we in terms of EPR? What are some of the great examples you'd perhaps like to cite? And but at the same time, do you welcome this new regulation? I guess you've already answered that, but perhaps you can just restate that. Do you welcome the involvement of government, and perhaps under what conditions do you welcome this implementation or this involvement from government?
To start off with the issues in South Africa, I think we're pretty advanced, particularly in Africa, but sometimes potentially even comparable to what's happening in the USA or Europe even. And that's largely been driven by responsible organizations who have gone the extra mile, which is the extended producer responsibility. And that has largely been a voluntary initiative. And South Africa has got a great track record in that. We've got a long way to go, but we've got a great track record. So we have different producer responsibility organizations that we've established. We have SA Plastics, we have the SA Plastics Packaging Association, we have Petco, Polyco, the Polystyrene Recycling Association, we have IWASA and other e-waste associations. And the reality is that they've been working with the responsible producers to look at trying to develop systems that are responsible. And the problem is always that they're at a disadvantage, although they have an advantage because it gives the consumer more confidence in terms of somebody who is showing that responsibility. But there's a lot of fly-by-nights. You know, we are essentially still a net importer of products. We have a lot of equipment and materials and produce coming into the country, which is not subjected to those same demands. And so a lot of the market has been getting away with it without having to contribute to it. And that's unfair. So the directives that have been put out by the EPR are really looking at expanding the net, and it's bringing everybody in to look at focusing on that responsibility. And they can either do it individually through their own organization, or they can join an existing PRO. But do I welcome it? Absolutely. We've been working at it for a long time. I wear several hats. I mean, obviously, I've been working with the National Recycling Forum, which incorporates all of these PROs, right down to the KZN Recycling Forum, and looking at the provincial initiatives. But the directive is to ensure that we bring everybody into that net. So a lot of that has been driven by industry. And when we started looking at the development of the EPRs, government wanted to have a very heavy hand in that. And we have seen that in the past. We've had the EPRs for tires and the plastic bags. Excuse me. And those are initiatives that really had a few problems. So I told you I had the flu. So
no
what we want to look at, they've moved from a Section 28, which is a government-led initiative, to a Section 18, which is an industry-led initiative. And that gives me a lot more hope in terms of being able to look at the implementation and rollout.
Great stuff. And yeah, that's very encouraging. And I see that, so just to deal with some acronyms there, I see that the regs which were implemented last week, in fact, 5th of May, they require that existing producers and producer responsibility organizations register with the department. Does this include importers? A, and B, what is a producer responsibility organization exactly? And maybe give us one or two examples, please.
Well, there's several examples. So I think Petco is a prime one that I mentioned, and that's obviously PET, polyethylene terephthalate, which is your Coke bottles, your water bottles. Right. And the PET collection rate through that PRO has increased dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. The organizations that contribute to that are voluntary, and they're most of the bigger processors or manufacturers of PET in the country. But there's still a huge amount that gets imported into the country, and that's often not accounted for. So the EPR also looks at covering importers. So if you're bringing in a product and you're not responsible in terms of the EPR from a voluntary perspective, you have an advantage because that cost is not coming against your company. The EPR directives now bring those people into the loop. So if you're importing a product in an imported PET vial, you now have responsibility for that, which is great. So that definitely closes the gap. The idea, again, with the PROs is to work with the infrastructure and the systems that have been put together over many years, rather than trying to reinvent that wheel. There's some great systems have been put into place in terms of looking at not only collection, but transportation, infrastructure, and processing systems to manage and handle those materials. But EPR is also wider than that. So EPR is also about trying to drive the market development. I mentioned to somebody the other day, I said, if we went out and we collected every scrap of any material, plastic, paper, cardboard, aluminium, right now we don't have the capacity to process it. We don't have the infrastructural capacity to manage it. So it's also about looking at creating markets. It's about looking at supply chains. It's about looking at value chains. It's about looking at everybody within that value chain, from the informal collector through to the baler to the processor. So the EPR is a great directive to bring everybody into that net, but it's also about managing expectations and looking at creating the infrastructure to accommodate that. So we're seeing corporations who are now coming out with great big statements, and they're saying that by year 2030, we will have 50% recycled content in our product. They need to get there. So there's a whole process in terms of that. So they now need to look at creating the infrastructure. They need the collection mechanisms. They need to mobilize the collectors. All of these need to come together, which is why we're saying don't do it now. I mean, we need 5 years to walk into that, but it's a process. So it's a catch-22. We need to look at, you can't put in the capital if there's nothing to feed that capital. At the same time, you can't look at the process without looking at the
Let me just stop with there. So beforehand, when we get Chris back, so we can just get full feedback.
Yeah. Right.
So I don't know if you caught that part, Gordon.
Yeah, I caught most of that. I think let's Chris, I think, is back, and just touching on one or two of the things that he's speaking about there, and one of the things that we can ask him about as well is having when you have the producer having this extended responsibility and taking back these products, they're obviously faced with certain challenges when they receive these products back. And so that's a source of or a trigger for innovation from their own manufacturing side, because they might say, okay, well, actually, we don't want to. We're going to take this stuff back, and we don't want to be faced with this problem when we get it back. So let's design it differently, so that let's say, for example, in the case of e-waste, for instance, let's assume that a company takes back a computer, but it's awkward to disassemble. They might say, okay, let's actually manufacture this thing differently so that it's designed for disassembly. So when we take them back, it's much easier to separate and reuse these components and ship those components and so forth. Chris, is that, I mean, is that also one of the key things as you see it arising from this?
It's a key issue, and a lot of it again is driven by already what's happening with leading organizations like IKEA, who are sort of leading the pack, and essentially what you get is this follow-on process where everyone's trying to catch up. If you look at what's happening in Europe right now, directives are being designed and developed around green design and green engineering, and that also links into carbon footprints. It links into imports and exports and supply chains. And the world is changing, not fast enough, unfortunately, but it's changing. And I think that we're seeing that where even within our own EPR directives, there are specific requirements around understanding, designing for recycling. If we design for recyclability, that really is a critical issue. And if people have to take it back, if they're responsible for that product afterwards, they're going to want it in the most recyclable product available. But Gordon, we also need to understand that plastic science is a complex science. I think I mentioned before, there are, it's not the 7 different types of plastics we see with the different 7 recycling symbols. There are thousands of different types of plastics, thousands. And a lot of them have been designed not because they're trying to be complicated. They've been designed in terms of providing the best functionality in terms of packaging the product they're designed for. So certain components allow packaging to breathe. Certain components allow non-UV interference from outside. They allow sort of water penetration or non-water penetration. there's different capacities that are structured around the design. So plastic engineering and designing is a massive industry, but at the same time, it's caused problems. So we need to look at EPR also driving that sector around looking at designing for recyclability. And there's an incredible amount of work if you look at the Loop or TerraCycle and some of the stuff that they're doing in terms of going back to reusable packaging. And there's a huge drive like that across the world at the moment. But we've got to make sure that that responsibility is there and understand that if there's another way around it, who pays ultimately? And we're looking at this producer pays responsibility, the polluter pays. And that's going to be handed down to the consumer as well. And we need to make sure that everyone in the value chain is adequately looked after. So extended producer responsibility is not just about the collection. It's not just about the systems. It's about understanding design, collection, infrastructure, markets, creating new markets for products. And that's the beauty of EPR, is that it expands that horizon to look at all these different components.
Yeah, and then obviously, as you've said on a number of occasions, make sure that everyone's on board and doing their bit. So just to go back to the regs, I see that the regs apply to electrical and electronic equipment, lighting, paper, packaging, and then it says some single-use product sectors, which I don't have information on at the moment. But I mean, it's a fairly limited list. I imagine, Chris, that they will grow this sector list and other sectors will participate. And we've spoken, for example, about the existence of producer responsibility organizations existing in other sectors such as automotive. I mean, what's your comment on that list of sectors, and how do you see that? How do you see that growing? I mean, are there other sectors perhaps that you're aware of that are doing excellent work, and are you curious as to why some of those sectors perhaps have not been included at this point?
The reality, if you look at the e-waste, remember e-waste is classified as hazardous waste in this country, and e-waste contains cadmium, molybdenum, lead, arsenic, all sorts of other lovely things, biphenyls and other complicated products. So it has been under the spotlight, as well as lighting. The lighting industry, we worked with compact fluorescent tubes, and those contain mercury. And for years, people have been throwing those in the dustbin, and it goes off in the black bag off to the landfill, and we're poisoning our land with mercury. But you know, a lot of people don't know that it's illegal to put your CFL bulb into your black bag. But it's happening because we don't have the knowledge out there. So again, the design side of things is about looking at designing out those problematic fractions. And that's why the industry is moving towards LEDs. And even with LEDs, there are problems with that. So now we're seeing industry move towards understanding the opportunity to recycle the different components so that they can harvest the rare earth metals and other products from those LEDs and the glass into new products and be more responsible going forward. And it's this constant progression. Packaging obviously has been there for a long time because it's the big bad boy. Everyone sees plastic waste in the river. And we're all pointing fingers at Coca-Cola and the polystyrene guys. But if you look at the Doozy Canoe Marathon, people aren't getting sick from plastic waste. They're getting sick from everything else. The oil waste, the industrial contamination from the sewerage. Plastic doesn't make you sick. It's just visually not very pleasant. But the idea is that obviously it is a big issue. We're looking at marine plastics being a big problem. So the packaging industry has been part of that first target. There are other initiatives that government has worked on. We've looked at some of the norms and standards around organic waste, and we have some leaders in there. The Western Cape provincial government has been very strong in terms of looking at a ban coming up very soon in terms of any organic matter going to landfill, but then making sure that they have the systems in place to manage that waste and add value to it. One of the other big ones is the construction industry. Construction demolition waste is 35% of what goes into our landfills. Why is there no EPR on that? That needs to come into the fray. We talk about the cement industry. which produces 8% of global emissions, contributing to climate change. The built environment contributes some 40% of all emissions that contribute towards climate change and global warming. And yet there's no EPR there. We need to target them. There needs to be a responsibility in terms of them understanding, again, the green design of their products and then taking responsibility thereafter. So we can't just smash up and put it in a landfill site. So there's a lot of things that are happening there, and we're seeing industry already gearing up for that because they see it coming. So the cement industry, for example, are already looking at trying to reduce their carbon footprint. They're looking at alternative fuels and alternative energies. They're looking at different systems in terms of reducing their carbon footprint. We have new systems coming into play, such as geopolymers, which use waste ash and mine tailings. Sorry about the Haridars in the background. And again, looking at low carbon applications. So we're getting that gearing in that's coming in already. I know Western Cape, again, leading in this thing, but they're looking at banning rubble going to landfill site, but they're putting in systems into place to look at market development for those products. So there's a lot of movement in different sectors. Those three that you mentioned, those are the target for now, but ideally it should expand to the other sectors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're touching on construction waste, for example, and we know that rubble in landfill sites those are actually the responsible builders whose rubble ends up in landfill sites. The irresponsible guys ends up just being dumped in the field nearby, and we know that the horrible impact that's having, and the immense cost it takes for council to clear that up. But there's obviously quite a disconnect in the construction industry, which makes EPR quite difficult. So you've got the architects and the property developers, or the property owner that builds the building in the first place, and then 20 years later you get someone who buys the house and decides he's going to demolish the garage or whatever and build a new garage, and the bucky builder who comes and does it just dumps it wherever he wants to. In some cases, obviously, you get responsible builders, as I've said, that pay the fees and go to the landfill and carry on. So, how do you, it highlights just how complicated it can be. And also, in a sense, that also just highlights the extent to which those that have demonstrated leadership in this regard should be commended. And so perhaps if are there any other examples of extended producer responsibility? I'll give you one that I'm participating in now as a consumer. As part of my wife's recent midlife crisis, we've acquired a Nespresso machine, and so all these capsules, of course, they add up very quickly. Before you know it, you've got a big bag of capsules, and we know that Nestle was put under a lot of pressure in recent years to do something about that. And they did. They came up with this: we'll collect your capsules. When you buy and when they deliver capsules, they take them back, and they ostensibly dispose of them responsibly or recycle them and so forth. But as you say, I mean, I can buy those capsules from any number of vendors nowadays. They're not offering to take back the capsules. It's a perfect example. Are there any other examples that you can think of, Byron? Are you exposed to any form of producer responsibility in your home at the moment?
At the moment, we try our best to save as much as possible. But there was a question I wanted to ask, but just by listening before I forget. So the question I wanted to ask, you mentioned something on finances, and the key word that gets me, redesign. And when I hear redesign, I just hear money being given out. Now, as a guy that runs his own company or whatever, it's not the way you want to go. So how do you convince these guys? Not convince. It's a responsibility. The word responsibility is in there. It becomes a responsibility in the end of the day. But also with the type of customers we have in South Africa, they talk about quality of a product and all these things. Doesn't it become more difficult on the service provider, on the producer, in the end of the day, they will have to outsource these. Yes, it's great for another guy coming along and taking over the responsibility, but it also puts more responsibility, I understand, on the producer, but it also can become a financially tedious in the end of the day. It can become a huge burden, and job losses become part of that, as I understand. Or maybe I'm wrong. I'm just asking that question.
I would like to think that the opportunity in terms of job creation is what comes out of extended producer responsibility. If we go back to the 1940s and the 50s, where we started inventing all these throwaway plastics, the problem is that we feel we own something. The problem is that with a lot of these single-use plastics, you own it for 5 minutes or half an hour. Yeah, that's a problem. A coffee capsule is virtually indestructible in a landfill site or in the environment. Those are big issues, but you're seeing movements. So Nespresso and others have come out with reusable capsules that the responsible consumer can follow through on. But again, that's a choice of the consumer. So the consumer, if he can't be bothered, just goes and buys the capsules anyway. Not everybody wants to fill their own capsule and wash it out and reuse it. So again, there's a responsibility that's coming out to the consumer. I mean, it's the same as you take it to the very basics. I never put green waste or vegetable cuttings into my bins. I have 8 compost bins at the bottom of the yard. So the birds and the bees and the beetles all love me for that, but I will not put it into my waste stream. And I produce my own compost, and it's great. But there are so many different applications and so many complications. As Gordon was mentioning with the construction industry, whose responsibility? Is it the engineer? Is it the designer? Is it the guy who's demolishing the building? Is it the guy who's building the building? Is it the person who owns the building? And these things need to be hammered out. And the EPRs, as we have them at the moment for the current 3 systems, are not perfect. They're not going to be perfect. But it's a start, and it allows us to work towards that. It's something that we can tweak and amend and change, and it allows us to move forward on the right path. So EPR is good, but there is a cost to that. And what you see is that with that cost comes innovation. So we're now seeing the producers being a lot more innovative in terms of their design. There are new systems coming out now with regards to white waste, for example, or white goods, which is part of the e-waste sector. So washing machines and fridges, where it's more based on the design for longevity, and the person doesn't buy the fridge; they rent the fridge for its usage. So it's in the interests of the producer to make sure that fridge is going to last 30, 40 years. So they're going to make it out of real steel, not out of mild steel that's going to rust on your kitchen floor within 2 years. So there's a change that's coming. And I think the idea is to ensure that with that change is not to burden the consumer. So if I had to go out and buy a new fridge every 2 years, I would pay the same amount if I bought a fridge that I could swap out, maintain, replace with a provider over the next 10 to 20 years, and I create that relationship. And again, there's an advantage, a consumer advantage there for particular companies to target that, where they can go for the discerning consumer and ensure a market share of it. But in creating these different systems, ideally what the EPR is trying to do is to create markets and opportunities for all of the waste products that do come out of there, and how we can design and develop those, which is going to unpack jobs in collection, sorting, transportation, pre-processing, processing, manufacturing, and that's the drive. So we need jobs in this country. Boy, do we need jobs in this country. And a lot of the regulations are really working against us. So in terms of looking at technology applications, there's a lot of problems in terms of compliance and legislation. We need to open those doors. We need to look at the opportunities in terms of innovation and design. We need to look at training young people to understand that. Some of the stuff that we're doing now with the World Resources Forum, for example, in the Lemba district, is to understand appliance banks. How do we set up systems where we can train people to fix a toaster or a kettle put it back into the system. Again, jobs, skills, and we're seeing more and more of that around green design. And that's a good way. So we're moving in the right direction. Again, no, we're not moving fast enough, but it is a step in the right direction. And again, plastics is a prime example. We look at the fact that the plastics industry has probably invested $300 billion over the last decade. That is going to increase the amount of plastics coming into the system by 40% over the next decade. And yet we're putting a fraction of that into recycling and waste management. So we've got to turn the tables. We've got to drive that directive. We need to get everybody in that value chain to understand where they stand in that, and make sure that we're all working together for the good of the planet, really.
100%. And Chris, and Byron, thank you very much indeed. That's all we've got time for. I'm going to just quickly chip in my own answer to Byron's question, just about the cost of design, or any aspect of extended producer responsibility, or indeed any aspect of companies trying to do their bit to create or to move from a linear to a circular economy. And yes, the truth is there is a cost, but actually that cost is already being borne presently. It's not being borne by the producer and therefore not being borne by the consumer, but it's being borne at the moment. And in fact, it's being borne by us broadly as a society. And the cost of that is what you see with plastics in the ocean, or the buildup of mercury in fish stocks, or the pollution of our rivers and so on and so forth, and the demise of species and so forth. So this combined asset that we have is being degraded, and that's where the cost is emerging presently. Now we have to change that. That's currently called an externality. That is, in economics, it means it's a cost that's not being borne inside your own economics, inside your own cost equation, and that's got to change. Externalities have to be brought into the economics of how we function, and in so doing, we will solve these problems. I don't believe there's any other way, actually. So yes, there is a cost. Will it push up? Is it a pain for the producer? Is it a cost for the producer? And will the consumer ultimately pay that price? Yes. But of course, it's also about efficiencies. So at the moment, as consumers, we are very wasteful, and I include myself in that. It's about efficiencies for the producer and the consumer, and ultimately, it could cost less. And there's no externality. So I think that's where we want to go, and that's really what we're talking to Chris about. So having had the last word on that, I'm now going to say, right, that's the end of the show. Thank you very much indeed. Once, especially to Chris, who's joined us as our guest, and your thoughts are so enlightening to us. And thank you very much indeed for your time, Chris. What I'd like to do is move on in the next series of shows to talk about very specific examples of circular economy within sectors. And what we can do just after the show is we can decide what sector we want to focus on in the next episode, and we'll make announcements about that. And we can possibly also invite additional guests who are from these specific sectors to join us, to comment. So I look forward to that, and thank you very much once again. Until next week, that's all from the Circular Economy Show. So thank you very much indeed.
See you, gents. Bye-bye. Corin said it all. I don't need to add anything on to that. Corin has locked it off. That's a professional on that side. So as I would just end up saying, greeneconomy.tv provide insight and intelligence on all sustainability-related matters.
How we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures.
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chaplat, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.